The US Army and the US Marine Corps have had a long-standing tradition of rivalry. Who is a better warrior, who trains harder, who shoots better. But what are the actual differences between two similar basic units of the two services? And how would those differences show themselves in an actual battle? A basic infantry platoon of Marines versus a basic US Army infantry platoon. Which unit would win that firefight? Both Marines and the Army use secure comms radios. In today's wars, it's unthinkable to have your data streams exposed to eavesdropping. This video is sponsored by NordVPN, a virtual private network app which can help you enjoy similar encryption levels in your everyday internet usage. Be it on Windows, macOS, Android or iOS, NordVPN will reroute your data through their secure servers. Not only will your data be encrypted, but you can choose the location of the servers. There's over 5,000 servers in 62 countries to choose from. For example, if you're watching your favorite streaming service while on vacation in another country, simply reroute traffic to get your usual content. You can enjoy peer-to-peer sharing and use up to 6 connections at once. And Binkov viewers are getting a special offer. Go to nordvpn.com/Binkov and use the code Binkov. You will get 68% off a 2-year plan and an extra month for free. Check out their rates and their offer by clicking the link below. Let's get back to our clash of platoons. The infantry platoon often has a few more troops attached to its core. Usually the totals today are around 42 Army soldiers versus 43 to 45 troops for the Marines. A few of those are medics, forward observers and such, sometimes from the battalion's artillery or medical units, or even US Navy personnel in the case of the Marines. Those are not considered to be core members of a platoon, but they are indispensable and are pretty much de facto platoon members. The biggest organizational difference concerns the fire squads. The US Army platoon has 3 rifle squads, as does the Marine platoon. But the Marine squad has 13 troops each, which populate the 3 fire teams that are part of their squad. The US Army squads have 2 fire teams, populated by a total of 9 troops. So now we're at 33 versus 43 or so troops. So there's one big difference, yet unmentioned. The Marines platoon doesn't have any organic heavy weapons, like mid-caliber machine guns or dedicated anti-tank detachments. Those detachment units do often operate with the Marines platoon in a regular combat setting, but they're actually part of the weapons platoon of the Marine company. On the other hand, the US Army platoon does have organic assets of such kind, so it has an additional 9-man squad, the weapons squad. Both sides can have further, usually company-level troops attached for added firepower, but without those, the US Army platoon is now complete at 42 troops. One could say the additional few troops ought to tip the scale, no? Certainly, if our tactical situation has both groups approaching each other from a few miles out, even one pair of eyes more could theoretically result in one side spotting the other earlier and thus gaining some initiative to dictate the battle. Both the Marines and the US Army have been test fielding some drones on the platoon and even squad level. But so far neither side has managed to field such drones to average platoons. The Army seems to be set on Black Hornet drones for the future, while the Marines seem to have decided in favor of the Instant Eye quadcopter. But today neither side uses such tech in most of its combat platoons. There are other factors in play as well. Let's look at how individual weapons compare. The composition and equipment of a platoon is often in flux. The Marines have, for example, decided to make their platoons even bigger in the future, with 15-member fire squads. But that's not yet applicable as a widespread measure, so it will be disregarded. Another transformation that will be taken into account is the Marines' conversion to the M27 assault rifle. While not all combat platoon units have fully switched to it, many have, so in this scenario the M27 is the regular infantry rifle within the Marines platoon. The M27 infantry automatic rifle is roughly similar to the previous Marine rifle, the M4 carbine, which the US Army still uses. It's based on the Heckler & Koch 416 design, which gives it some advantages over the US Army's M4A1 rifle. Basically, the Marines rifle has a 2-inch longer barrel. It's more precise and its firing mechanism is more reliable. Some tests suggest up to 3 times more rounds shot before a malfunction compared to the M4. Of course, the Army's own tests claim the M4A1 is only slightly less reliable than the M27. A drawback exists as well. It's 25% heavier, so over a long mission or in a sprint, the soldier carrying it might get tired a tad quicker. The sight on both is basically the same, though the Marines variant offers a tad less magnification. A curious decision given that it's coupled with a rifle that's naturally more precise. The M27, in the hands of a good marksman, can hit point targets out to 600 meters, which is roughly 100 meters farther than the Army's M4's effective range. But that's on a shooting range. Such distances may not be applicable in a battle. Your average battlefield is bound to have at least some bushes, trees, a slope, or even a house obstructing at least part of the view, and the enemy would be shooting back. US Army tests have shown actual precision at long ranges is not that good, which is why the US Army shooting qualifications are done to distances of up to 300 meters. Rarely have in the history of wars regular infantrymen had to use their rifles over longer distances. Peculiarly, Marines do train at even longer distances. Their qualifications include shooting at 200, 300 and 500 yards. But comparing two different training methods is not a clear-cut task. The Marines' rifle qualification tests use known distances to well-marked targets, and Marines have more time to aim a shot on average. US Army training is a bit more representative of possible real-world shooting situations with harder target recognition. Pretty much the entire Marine platoon is standardized at using the M27 rifle, and that includes the automatic rifleman roles. Basically, the same rifle is also providing fire support in the fire squad. The only outlier might be the potential presence of designated marksmen in a fire squad. Those use the M38 rifle, basically a variant of the M27. The biggest difference is a more powerful scope with up to 8 times magnification. The US Army fireteam roster is more varied. Most fireteam members have the M4A1 carbine, yes, but one soldier has the M249 light machine gun. It's a 5.56mm weapon, the same caliber as the other rifles, but it's a heavier weapon. It usually uses a 200-round belt, and in that configuration it weighs a whopping 22 pounds. Interestingly, the Marines did use the same weapon in their fireteams, but have since switched to the M27 for automatic fire as well. The main reason was precisely the added weight and some reliability issues. Regular fireteams also have some explosive weapons on both sides. Each Army fireteam has one grenadier, using a 40mm grenade launcher. That's 6 grenadiers for the Army, compared to 9 grenadiers for the Marines, as they have more fireteams. Those 40mm grenade launchers can deliver imprecise fire to almost 400 yards away, or they could deliver precise hits on individual enemy troops at some 160 yards away. The US Army fireteam usually carries some basic unguided anti-armor weapons, such as the AT-4 rocket-propelled grenades. Usually one fireteam can be expected to carry 1 or 2 such disposable launchers. The Marines, up to a few years ago, were expected to carry an Mk153 launcher and some rockets. Their weapon was heavier and more cumbersome, but was multi-use. Realistic line of sight range for both is a few hundred meters, perhaps 500 meters at most, but the Marines seem to be transforming their platoon, so the upper echelon units, such as the Marine Company, are distributing the AT weapons on a case-by-case basis. So it might be that the average Marine platoon today, whisked away into battle with no prior prep time, doesn't even carry any such AT weapons. Both weapons were designed primarily against bunkers and medium armored vehicles. Their warheads could inflict injuries even to enemies standing a few feet away. Still, they're not really an effective way to deal with infantry. Both do have high explosive warhead variants, but it's unlikely the average platoon would carry more than a couple of those. The 40mm grenade launchers would be more useful most of the time. And now we come to the big guns. The US Army Weapons Squad. The Marines have nothing of the sort in their platoon organically. The Army platoon has 2 M240 machine guns. That's a 7.62mm machine gun, and a fairly heavy one at that. But the heavy round and the big barrel does mean its effective range reaches 900 yards. The gun would be quite useful for laying down suppressive fire even at such long distances. The downside is of course that every 100 rounds weighs 7 pounds, so the mobility of those weapon teams is not comparable to the Marines' mobility. The two anti-armor teams have soldiers with M4 carbines, which might be used a lot in this particular situation, but otherwise their main weapon is either a javelin-guided anti-tank missile or a Carl Gustaf M3 recoilless rifle. The latter is an unguided weapon, but the rounds could reach 1400 yards. The Carl Gustaf has a wide variety of round options, including warheads for clearing out infantry behind cover. Again, how many of such warheads would usually be carried by an unbriefed platoon is questionable. One might expect one AT team within the weapon squad to use the Carl Gustaf, while the other would use the Javelin missile. The Javelin is guided, very precise, up to 2500 meters away, but its current warhead is an anti-armor warhead, so unless it lands right next to an enemy, it might not even wound them. There is a multi-purpose warhead being developed, but its deliveries to the US Army will start only later this year and continue for some time until they're standard. A new sighting system will also enable longer range engagements, but those are currently not available to the platoon in our scenario. Javelin's existing thermal targeting unit is sensitive enough that US platoons have been known to use it to confirm their targets at night or masked in smoke, rather than rely just on their other equipment. That might give the army guys some edge if there's a night fight. There's hardly been a word about non-gunnery training though. But how does one quantify training and keep it objective? Today the army training is longer than Marines training. The basic training course for the army is 10 weeks versus 13 weeks for the Marines. Once they start gunnery training, both have some 6 weeks remaining. But the US Army trains more hours per week on average than the Marines. The Marines also do some specific water training, like a full week of just swimming training in various conditions. The physical fitness tests are also not directly comparable, as some tests feature crunches, the other tests feature sit-ups, and so on. Marines have to run for longer, but with more time allowed. There is no real palpable difference that would give either side an edge in modern combat with firearms. The army guys have recently started receiving a longer infantry school training. They went from a 4-week course to basically a 12-week course. The Marines have 8 weeks of such specialized training. That's additional experience for specific jobs, maneuvering as a team, grenade usage, navigation or role-specific tasks like mortar usage, vehicle usage, etc. Of course, with the Army's change being so recent, most of its units have not gone through such training. On the field, the two formations would be similarly poised to detect each other, but the Marines may have a very slight edge. They're slightly more mobile as a unit as they have fewer heavy weapons, and they have a few more pairs of eyes. The Army platoon may however have a slight edge at night due to their Javelin AT missile sensor. The mobility edge isn't that great though. Besides the weapons, Marines and Army men carry all sorts of stuff. 70 pounds of various equipment per person is a very usual load, with 100 pounds also being common. For example, just the body armor, which is quite comparable for both sides, weighs 30 pounds when fully equipped. That means it has plates capable of defeating 5.56mm rounds. Still, most of the body is only lightly protected, so the overall weight advantage for the Marines, compared to army guys having to lug the heavy weapons around, would be perhaps 10 or so %. Being slightly more mobile, the Marines might be able to evade a night fight if they deem it would not be advantageous to their position. Certainly, if one side manages to detect the other and remains itself undetected, that in itself would be half the battle. The side with greater situational awareness would be able to devise a plan of attack and position itself favorably around the enemy. Potentially, depending on the surroundings, even perform some sort of an ambush. But the recon edge is fairly minor. In almost as many cases, the army unit will spot the Marines at the same time, and the army does have some longer reach weapons. In a real environment, it would really be more of a game of hide and seek, one side trying to outmaneuver the other. one side running away if needed until they get to a favorable position. But let's say our scenario forces combat on both sides. They can't run away, they have to press on. The army's 2 mid-caliber machine guns would be quite handy there, laying suppressive fire, possibly pinning down and preventing a whole fire team of Marines from moving, each. The army's light machine guns would also present a minor advantage in such a scenario over the Marines' M27, and the precise, guided one shot from the javelin might result in an insta-kill, which might be problematic for the Marines if the person killed is, say, a squad leader. The Carl Gustaf is also a pretty good force multiplier, as it can outrange the Marines' weapons, and it should have at least one high explosive warhead within the platoon. So the army guys might get some early kills, before the distance between the two sides goes down to 600 or 700 yards. Both sides might have or are even likely to have a few marksmen in their platoons. Some army marksmen use the regular M4A1, but with better optics, while some use the M110 rifle, which is a 7.62mm caliber weapon. Those are somewhat better than even the M38 marksman rifles the Marines would use, as they also have a slightly larger and greater magnification scope. So the army platoon might bring down a few more Marines, before the Marines manage to close in enough. Now, all this is very terrain dependent. If we are talking about a perfectly flat meadow, the Marines would face an uphill battle, so to say. The machine guns would pin them down. But if there are bushes, a house and some slopes, those machine guns might not be able to fully utilize their reach. Of course, that also applies to the advantage the Marines might have once they get to 500 yards away from the army guys. Yes, they train to shoot at 500 yards away and their rifles are more precise, but if the shot isn't clear, that advantage is lost. If the US Army presses on, at some 350 meters away, the Marines would have another advantage: their 940mm grenade launchers within the platoon, compared to the Army's 6. Each of those 40mm grenades could be quite deadly. Each grenadier would likely carry half a dozen grenades, but sometimes even more, and a well-aimed shot might wound several enemy troops at once. The body armor both sides use would be quite useful in preventing a lot of grenade kills, as they're good against such small fragments. Still, an incapacitated person, even if the wound is not lethal, is often a liability. Both sides use the M320 grenade launcher, which is more precise than the old M203 under-barrel launcher. The M320 was designed to be used either as an under-barrel launcher or as a standalone weapon, with a buttstock for added support. If the fighting distances manage to stay at 500 yards and the army's machine guns are somehow neutralized, the Marines would likely win. But in reality, the machine guns would be just as much of an edge at that range as the Marines' standard-issue rifles and their marksmanship. There would also be smoke grenades used, and it's quite possible many clear shots at long ranges would not be applicable. If the fight somehow manages to degenerate to extremely short ranges, perhaps due to terrain and surroundings, the Marines do have one small advantage: they still train for bayonet use. The army guys, while their knives can be used as a bayonet, do not train for that type of combat anymore. The end result of a fight is thus inconclusive. Depending on many factors, one side might be better than the other. Flatlands would favor the army platoon. Terrain with some middling amount of obstacles would favor neither side. Though as one gets closer, the Marines' indirect fire grenade launcher edge might prevail, and up close, exchanging fire at just 100 yards away, it would mostly be about numbers, both in troops and shots per minute. Marines have more troops in their unit, but the army guys may still be able to lay down more bullets. With even part of one side's squads being suppressed, the effective numerical advantage may change. After all this, one might have a feeling Binkov favors the US Army just ever so slightly. In a forced battle, that's perhaps so, like winning 55 of 100 fights. But a forced attack is not realistic. If Marines can run away and keep outmaneuvering their slightly less mobile enemy, then their chances improve, especially if there is a river around. The Marines training in water environment may further help them outmaneuver the opponent. And what about a situation where the exact same number of troops faces each other with similar weapons? Again, the result might be slightly different, but this video showed the actual consequences would be quite similar. That's why the final result is more or less a draw. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.